have to figure out where to look so that I'm not just looking at myself for this presentation. But I'm grateful to be here. I'm excited to just, I think, begin the discussion on trauma. I want to share with you what I've learned in being a trauma coach over the past few decades, or a couple decades, as well as the next steps. And that's like what's most fascinating for me is like, what are the next steps? Because everybody's first step is not the same, and it depends on what you've done and how much work you've already put in, and maybe what type of trauma. And so let me screen share. Let's see, from current slide. Let's see if that works. Sorry, guys. There we go. All right. So what is trauma? Trauma is a single big event or a series of small events that are life-threatening or perceived that way. Trauma is an event that causes someone to feel hurt, discarded, unloved, unwanted, or uncared for. It can be from growing up in dysfunction, watching a loved one struggle with an illness, or a single event such as a car crash or witnessing a fight. What is traumatic for you may not be traumatic for someone else. It does not matter why certain events were traumatic for us, but just acknowledging that they were and taking the steps to heal our old wounds. When trauma is left unresolved, the feelings are often recreated in future relationships and work situations. And so, what I hope for you to gain from that is that you could have had a very good childhood, but if you had a very sickly mother, or maybe you had a sibling that passed away, that's traumatic. And there's things called big T and little t trauma. And so big T trauma is something that really explosive happened that almost everybody would agree is traumatic. If you were physically abused or sexually abused, like there's a general consensus that that's a big T trauma. But let's just say that you had a father that was drunk every day, but he didn't really yell, he just wasn't available. That's a series of little T traumas. And that might not have been a big deal. I get clients and they'll say things like, oh, this person just really chewed me out on the phone, and they're traumatized by it. And I'm like, what happened? Oh, well, she told me that I was talking too much. And now I didn't feel like that was a traumatic situation, but it doesn't matter what I feel about it. It matters what you feel about it. And so based on what history we have, things trigger us, and certain things are traumatic for us, whether again, like it's a car crash or witnessing somebody fighting. All of those things, depending on our own personalities or our processing systems, depending on how resilient we are, it can traumatize us. And so let me go back to the slide. So why treat trauma? Oh, one more, sorry. Why treat trauma? So addiction is a disease of the mind, body, and spirit. We treat physical symptoms by removing substances that create cravings, alcohol, gambling, processed foods, etc. Once the expression of our addiction is removed, we are left with all the reasons we started to eat or use in the first place, our unresolved trauma. If there's any hope of staying free from addictive foods, our trauma needs to be acknowledged and healed, and my groups begin that process. So maybe you don't have an addiction problem. Most of us have some sort of process addiction, but if that's not you, then maybe you have a symptom of growing up with trauma, and you need to recover the symptom instead of an addiction. And so these are common symptoms of growing up with dysfunction. Dysfunction or trauma, those words can be used interchangeably. So maybe you confuse normal behavior with dysfunctional behavior, which might mean you're just used to getting yelled at, or you think it's normal for somebody to hang up on you in the middle of a conversation. And you just think that's normal because that's what you grew up with. You avoid honesty to avoid true rejection. Maybe you're somebody that just agrees, like, oh, yeah, I like that too. Or you're not going to tell someone that you had a bad day because you don't want them to not like you. You judge yourself mercilessly. We call this having the inner critic, where there's just nothing that you can do right. And it's just a relentless nagging in your head. Maybe you feel like you're surviving, not living, which goes right to the next one. You have difficulty having fun. Take yourself too seriously. Lose the ability to feel or disassociate. Before I started my trauma work, I would tell people, I go, I only know how to act nice. I don't think I really know how to be nice. I don't know how to love people. I only know how to act like I love people. And they said, oh, of course you love people, Haven. And it wasn't until the trauma work that I realized that I had disassociated so much from my body that I wasn't feeling the pain anymore, but I wasn't feeling the joy either. And so I felt like I was just sort of walking through life, acting like I had emotions, but not really knowing how to feel them. Overreact to the unexpected. Um, Another example, my husband stopped by from work unexpectedly, and I felt so triggered because I'm like, he's a liar. He told me he was at work and he stopped by the house to say hi to me. And my overreaction to the unexpected tells me that I was dealing with trauma. Constantly seeking approval and affirmation. That could be like people pleasing. Feel that I am different from other people. I am extremely loyal, even in the face of evidence that the loyalty is undeserved. And so I had grade school friends that were bullies, and I would stay friends with them, even though they did not deserve my friendship. Feel alone, even when with people. Fear people and or authority figures. Become approval seekers. Be frightened of angry people. And they don't actually have to be angry. You can just be frightened of potential anger. Be terrified of personal criticism. And that goes back into maybe avoiding honesty so that you can't criticize me. I also did a lot of perfectionism so that I felt like I would be beyond reproach. You couldn't say anything bad about me because I was so good. I became an addict or married them or both, viewed life as a victim, have an overwhelming sense of responsibility, be concerned more with others than themselves, feel guilty if you stand up for yourself, even if you know it's a reasonable request, like you're tired and you don't want to go out that day, but you feel guilty because you know that person really wants to go out. Addicted to excitement. This is really good for procrastinators. You know, like you wait until the deadline, and just something about being addicted to that thrill of will you or won't you make it. Confuse love and pity by loving people who need rescuing. And so when I was in my teens or early 20s, I would date people that were really bad with money because then I could come in and like rescue them from themselves. Stuff my feelings. I did that with my food addiction. Have low self-esteem, become terrified of abandonment, and react to events instead of taking a pause, which means I might be saying something before I even really know what solution I want. And so, why is it important to have those identifiers? Because a lot of people have no idea that they had trauma or dysfunction in their childhood. And why would you? Why would you think that there was anything abnormal with the way that you were raised? Because so much of it is like, it's just your family. You don't have another family that you grew up in to compare it to. You might know that your family was different, but you didn't know that it was dysfunctional. And maybe your family was fine. And so we have a whole other family that we live in, and that's our community. And there is so much dysfunction within our culture. And so I grew up in Laguna Beach. I had no idea that it was dysfunctional to expect girls to weigh under 100 pounds well into puberty. That was just my cultural norm. And I had no idea it was abnormal until me and my mom, we started traveling to other places in the country. And so, but why would I know that it was dysfunctional if it was the only normal I had? But I had those symptoms. I had that symptom of just like feeling that wrongness. And so I'm going to go through some books. I have a book club. and you guys are more than welcome to it. Like, it's just an hour of elevated conversation once a month. We pick a new book every month, and it's great. And so, but one of the first books that I recommend for people that are just starting to figure out that they're healing from trauma is What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And it's a great audio book, really easy. And she explains, or Bruce Perry explains in the book, that when we grow up with dysfunction or we grow up with trauma, what happens is that our brain creates a message. And that message says, you're wrong. That's the only reason why this would be happening to you. And so then you grow up and you keep that message because you have two choices. Either your childhood was wrong and you have to reprogram your brain, right? Or you're wrong and you just keep creating situations in your adulthood that create you being wrong. And so you pick relationships that make you wrong, and you pick bosses that make you wrong, and you keep recreating these systems within your life that confirm the way your brain thinks about you. Because your brain would rather you be wrong and the way you think be right than having to question the entire way that you think. And it's scary. It's scary to start questioning these base level ideas of who am I? Or have these messages that I've been raised with even true? So a lot of people, when they first start doing trauma work with me, well, one is not every therapist is a trauma therapist. It's really important to find somebody that knows how to hold on to events that have happened and create compassion. All trauma work is about building compassion for yourself and for others. The first thing we do is we take the blame off yourself. Like, you are not wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. It's not your fault. And it's not anybody else's fault. And so it's really easy to say, like, you're right. It's not my fault. It's my parents' fault. And then we start getting angry and we get like vindicated. And that's not the right answer either, because there's generational dysfunction. And so with generational dysfunction, it means like, who were my great grandparents? And then who were my grandparents? And who were my parents? And we learn within the systems like who we're supposed to be. And so when I look at my great grandmother, she would only buy clothes that would fit her body. And she was like 5'10". And my grandmother and my great aunt, they were 5'2", and their entire bodies were different. But my great grandmother had a right idea of what a woman was supposed to look like. And so my grandmother was raised like just feeling wrong. And so who was my grandmother to my mother? Sorry, mom. Like that my mom had a wrongness about her, right? And that like my mom needed to look a certain way. And she would comment on the way that my mom would look. And she would say that I wasn't blonde enough. And so then my mom, she never said anything bad about the way I looked, but she would criticize herself. And so now I come into my own and I wonder, like, why do I have body image issues? I'm like, I am dealing with over 5 generations of body issues. I could not have escaped it. And each generation did what they could to heal a little bit, you know, but it's not my fault. It's not my mom's fault. It's not my grandma's fault. And it's not my great grandmother's fault. We have been learning this family dysfunction. And that's just one area. Let me see. I've got, if I can pull this up quickly enough for you. There it is. Other types of dysfunction, people that get divorced, that might run in your family where you're taught. It is a generational dysfunction, verbal abuse, criticism, overspending, over-religious, heavy debting, pill popping, obesity, being a thief, being an inmate, being a martyr, being a pedophile, keeping arguments going, glorifying fighting, cheating, being a loner, being a people pleaser, being argumentative. These are all things that are learned generation to generation. And maybe you aren't, so let's say that you're a teetotaler, you know, and your parents were the alcoholics and you were never going to pick up a drink. You are still doing the same dance. You watched them overdrink, so you're doing the opposite. And so if you have kids that are now drinking the same way your parents did, even though you never did, it wasn't healed, it was just avoided. You were taking a step back to their step forward. And so there's just so much healing to be done. What I've learned, is that it's not on me. Like, it's not on me to heal all of it, but just to heal the best that I can. So the first step is building a relationship with a loving voice. Most anybody, no matter what kind of background they come from, can recognize and identify with having a critical voice, that voice that says you should, right? You should have done better. You're always going to screw up, or you're never going to get it. And so that type of critical voice is normally taught to us either by family, by teachers, or by society. And there's a part of it that's protective. It's this idea that if we are harshest on ourselves, then nobody else can be harsh to us. But it's not true. We just end up beating ourselves up all the time in like a preemptive way, trying to avoid hurt, but instead we're just hurting all the time. And so the first step, again, like all trauma work, is compassion work. It's about building up your self-compassion and then building the compassion for the world around you. And so there is a loving voice that we start to create. And we ask, like, what is the kindest, most loving way that you could respond to anybody in this situation? How would you talk to a 3-year-old that's trying their best? How would you talk to your best friend? And then you start giving that to yourself. Other ways are to start moving stuck grief. And so for like my childhood, there was just certain events that like didn't feel right, but I didn't know why. Right. And so once I asked, like, what would your ideal situation be? Like the best thing in the entire world, it's like where you're swooped up and like kissed on the cheek and like swung around and like everybody's happy to see you, compared to like nobody being home when you got there. Right. I mean, parents working is a normal thing. Right. So if you come home to an empty home, like, why would that be traumatic or why would that be painful? But it's like, if I consider what my ideal situation would have been, which is like everybody stops what they're doing and everybody's like praising Haven for coming home and there's a party, compared to coming home alone, like that's a lot to grieve. And so then I get to start moving that stuck grief and start seeing that, like, even though nothing happened, right, I still had something traumatic going on where I had an ideal compared to the reality. And so from that first paragraph, it's just so important where like nobody else needs to co-sign and say, yeah, that was traumatic. It's traumatic because you said so. And so identifying like what you would have liked to happen, how you would have liked to have been spoken to, so that you can start grieving like what actually happened. And it doesn't have to be realistic. It just has to be an acknowledgement, because our feelings aren't realistic. I want to share the books that I recommend for people's like next steps in learning more about trauma. But what I want to say is trauma work is about having heart to hearts. And so some people call it soul talk. I call it heart to hearts, where you go and you tell somebody like, my heart hurts because, and it was so beautiful, like people sharing their sorrows, because it was just about feeling with you. And so society has not been taught how to have a heart to heart. Society has not been taught how to say, wow, that sounds hard for you. That sounds painful. I'm so sorry you went through that. Society has taught you to say, yeah, but were you expecting it? But yeah, I mean, how old was he? Or how long ago was it? Or, and society crushes our emotions by using the logical mind. And the more trauma work you do, the more you'll realize that society is not ready to have a heart to heart with you. And so your world will become a little bit smaller as you find the people that are willing to hold pain with you. And it is such a beautiful thing for those people that don't try to minimize, don't try to solve, and just want to hold with you. Like, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm so sorry your heart is hurting. And it becomes this really beautiful experience. And so I'll say, like, I had 2 miscarriages. And so the first one, I used my own logical mind to crush my feelings on it. Like, it happens 1 in 3, you know? And then the second one devastated me. And I really needed help with my emotions. I needed someone to hold my hand to walk me through it. And society didn't know how to do that. they would say like, but how far along were you? But were you expecting it? Something must have been wrong with the baby. And all of those things are logic. That has nothing to do with having a heart to heart. And in order to help somebody get through a trauma, you have to be able to hold on to their heart with them. They have their own logical mind. They can talk themselves into it. That's not what's needed for trauma work. What's needed is the ability to be there in feeling with somebody. So let me just finish up the slides. Um, okay, there we go. Let me see if I, from current slide. There you go. All right, so this is my first book that I highly recommend, What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. It is really like the elementary level, like such easy to understand book about trauma. And the premise behind it is instead of asking like what's wrong with you, you ask what happened to you. Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, it gives us the verbiage of how to talk about emotions so that you actually know what each emotion means. It's like going to law school or medical school. It has its entirely different different language. And so when we start talking about trauma and talking about emotions, we need to know what emotions are. And Atlas of the Heart will be the best way for that. Body keeps the score. The reminder that when we actually have like a physical response to trauma, it affects the way that we feel in our bodies. And so in the book, it says something like 70% of kids with trauma have asthma because when we get into a traumatic state, we don't breathe well. We start having short, shallow breaths, which create an asthmatic response. And it's just one of the many examples of how our body keeps the score of our trauma, and that we need to be able to heal the trauma and walk through it and have a grief to completion for things if we want to be in the healthiest body that we can be. John Bradshaw's Homecoming. This is the book that we'll be reviewing on April 6th. You can listen to it for free on YouTube, and I hope that you do. And it's a series of meditations that get you reconnected to your inner child so that maybe nothing really bad happened in your childhood, but you just sort of have a feeling, maybe you relate to the trauma symptoms, but you don't know what was traumatic. And homecoming meditations will help you feel and acknowledge and have some insights into what was going on with you. 5 Languages of Love. I don't recommend listening to this in a relationship. I recommend listening to it in a relationship with yourself. And so you have an inner child that desperately needs attention. And if you consider these 5 love languages in a way of how to best love yourself, you'll start creating a really deep connection. Like, what kind of gifts do you like to give yourself? What type of quality time means something for you? Especially for the music that we listen to today, the body is not an apology. The idea that, not one body is beautiful, not one personality is beautiful, that we are beautiful, and that there is a real sickness in our society of what is perceived as acceptable beauty, that you're supposed to be of a certain height and a certain age and a certain weight, and to break that mold. And this book really helped me start asking those questions, like, why do I feel I have to be under this number or above this height or this color hair? My hair is starting to turn gray. And that acceptance of like, who said I couldn't have gray hair? God. Someone needs to be muted. Power of Now, how most of our trauma is stuck from not being able to live in the present, that we are holding in a lot of pain if we are replaying things from the past or projecting into the future, and the beauty of actually living like in this moment. And the more in this moment we can get, the more we can see that like it's okay, like in this moment all is well. The 4 Agreements. The Myth of Normal is really, really hard, but it's a beautiful book. again, about trauma and our toxic culture. So not all trauma comes from family. It can definitely come from our culture. And finally, You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. And that's about how important it is for the words and affirmations that we speak to ourselves. And what I learned about Louise Hay is that whenever I get emotional disappointment, I get a physical ouchie on my shoulder. And so I had to start asking, like, how do I express disappointment? And so it's all connected. I appreciate your guys' time. I hope that you guys dive deeper into the healing of trauma so that you can live your best todays. And